Good evening. I'd like to call the August 19, 2021 meeting of the Peoria Planning and Zoning Commission to order. Welcome. To begin, I'd like to read our brand new opening statement. The Planning and Zoning Commission is composed of Peoria citizens who have been appointed by the City Council to serve on the commission as a civic responsibility without compensation. Our duty is to study and review the planning and zoning issues within the City of Peoria. The Commission holds public hearings or may conduct a study session on a topic. Decisions made by the Commission on general plan amendments, rezonings, and text amendments are forwarded as written recommendations to the City Council. The City Council will consider the recommendation of the Commission and make the final determination. The City Council may concur with the decision, modify it, overturn it, or remand it back to the Commission for further consideration. For conditional use permit applications, the Planning and Zoning Commission will act as the determining body and may approve or deny or continue the application. Any member of the public may appeal the decision of the Commission to the City Council regarding a conditional use permit. The appeal must be submitted in writing to the Planning and Community Development Department within 15 calendar days of the date of the Commission's decision. As Arizona and Peoria continue to be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, tonight's meeting is being conducted using measures to protect the health and safety of the public while discussions, deliberations, and actions of the Planning and Zoning Commission remain transparent. To ensure the health and safety of those attending tonight's meeting, members of the public should wear facial coverings inside city buildings, including the council chambers, regardless of vaccination status. Members of the public who wish to watch the meeting remotely may do so by viewing a live stream broadcast on Facebook at facebook.com/City of Peoria AZ, as well as on the Digital Peoria channel on YouTube. The meeting is also broadcast on Cox Channel 11 and CenturyLink Channel 8509. Additionally, the posted agenda online invited citizens with comments or questions on any agenda item to submit those by 5 p.m. in advance of the meeting. If you have comments or questions following tonight's meeting, you can submit those to the Planning Department by emailing planning@peoriaaz.gov. In the interest of maintaining a fair and efficient hearing, the Commission will adhere to the following steps during tonight's meeting. Each case will be called in the order in which it appears on the agenda, unless otherwise announced. Chair will open the case. City staff will then provide a brief report and recommendation. The applicant is then invited to give a presentation. Then the chair will read the submitted testimony provided by the public in advance of the meeting. After all of the testimony has been taken, we will invite the applicant back up to provide any rebuttal or final statements. Finally, we will have the commission discussion and decision. And that concludes our opening statement. Let's begin tonight with a roll call. Commissioners, please indicate your presence after I call your name. Secretary Linda Grice.
Present.
Commissioner Sean Hutchinson.
Present.
Commissioner Jeff Nelson. Commissioner Brad Schaefer.
Present.
Commissioner Josephine Waitman.
Present.
And Vice Chair Tony Fider.
Present.
Thank you. This is the final call for speaker request forms. If you'd like to address the commission tonight, please fill out a speaker request form. We have them available just outside the entrance to the chambers and up front at the podium. Next is the consent agenda. The consent agenda is for items that are routine in nature and will be enacted by one motion. There are two items on tonight's consent agenda. 1C, disposition of absence, and 2C, minutes from the July 15, 2021 meeting. Commissioners, do we have any questions or comments on the consent agenda? Okay, do I have a motion for the consent agenda?
Mr. Chair, I'll move on that motion.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Commissioners, please vote. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We'll move on to our regular agenda. We have 3 items tonight. First item, 3R, school-related traffic coordination. Presentation and possible discussion regarding ongoing coordination between City of Peoria traffic and various private and public schools. This item is for discussion only. Staff, please present your report.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, good evening good evening tonight. This is the first of 3 study sessions tonight on 3 very interesting topics, but topics that deal with aspects of how we manage growth and development in the city. This first topic deals with traffic coordination, and it's a big thing for us, particularly in August with all the school openings. So to my left, I've got Brandon Fourie, he's Assistant City Traffic Engineer, and he's going to talk through this topic.
Good evening, Chairman Alsup and the members of the Commission. I am here to talk about all the great things that we're doing here at the City of Peoria, and then specifically in the Traffic Engineering Division, to assist our schools. And as Mr. Hawkins had stated, this is for all schools, public, private, all grade levels. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of the basics of our services that we do provide. One of the main things that doesn't get a lot of attention but is quite important is that we have school operating agreements with every school that operates a 15-mile-an-hour school crossing. And that's something that is an agreement between the city and the school district or individual schools. So those are something that's actually pretty strictly regulated. We also provide services in the form of signs and markings, particularly in the right-of-way. And the element that we do with Peoria that's, I would say, I believe unique for Peoria, for all the cities within the valley, is a level of coordination with schools on and off-site for developing circulation plans, which is a huge, that's a huge benefit to the residents of Peoria, because what happens on a school campus very often spills out of the campus and onto the surrounding streets. So this is an exhibit that shows a sample of a school crossing agreement, one of the most recent we'd completed with a new, I'd say a relocation of a school crossing at Sundance Elementary School. So the high points on this agreement are that it states whether it's a new or relocated crossing or whether we're changing the hours. But we also state the hours of operation for the school because that's critical when the signs are allowed to be in the street. We have requirements that the signs can only go out no more than 45 minutes before the bell rings, and they have to come down no later than 30 minutes after the end of the school day. And that's something that is sometimes violated. We coordinate with the school to make sure they understand the terms of the agreement. But one of the other elements that's very important for the crossing agreement is it states whether an adult crossing guard is a requirement or a simple recommendation. Although I will say in all cases, an adult crossing guard is always recommended, but not necessarily required. This is an example of some of the support we provided one of our schools with in the form of signs and markings. This is Paseo Verde Elementary School on 79th Avenue and Greenway. At this particular school, the school was experiencing some challenges with a lot of concentration of activities at the four-way stop of 79th and Greenway. The crossing guard had four legs of the crosswalk to cross while there was heavy traffic at the intersection. So we worked with the school to develop an idea for an additional crossing north of that intersection to take a lot of the pressure of the student crossings from that busy intersection to where the students would cross, where there are much fewer activities, much less going on. And in order to accomplish this, we not only developed the operating agreement with the school, but we had also, through coordination with our Public Works Department, issued the request to install the, actually not only install the crosswalk, the markings, the signs associated, but in this particular example, you can see a little bit of red curb there as well. That's not a service that we normally provide. The Public Works crews don't paint curbs, but it was a pilot project with the Peoria Unified School District to allow them to paint some red curb to reinforce some of the existing no parking restrictions to see if that helps notify parents more than just the simple sign that it is definitely a no parking area. This is another example at Sundance Elementary School where we had recently worked for a new circulation plan, and in order to implement that circulation plan, there were changes that were required to be made to the signs and markings, particularly the striping on Cholla. In this case, we had to remove a bike lane to shift the lane over to provide a queuing lane so cars could line up along Cholla without blocking the bike lane and relocate that bike lane adjacent to the parking or queuing lane. And it was an integral element of the circulation plan. I particularly like this example because, as you can see in the photo, there's also our green bike lane markings that you're going to begin seeing more and more throughout the city of Peoria as we continue to push the initiative within the general plan to highlight and emphasize more innovative treatments for bicycles and pedestrians. So I did mention circulation plans a little bit, and this is really the meat of what takes up our time because it's so involved. To give an overview of what we do for a school circulation plan, and I will say most cases they're existing sites. We will be contacted either by a parent, by the principal, by a crossing guard, could be anybody that expresses a concern. We'll coordinate with the school directly, and our first step is to do observations at the school. When we do those observations, we like to do them in the morning and the afternoon. We physically walk the campus and count all the cars that are lined up at the time the bell rings, all the cars that are not in parking spaces. So if they're lined up in the parking lot, taking spaces in the parking lot where they're really not supposed to be, on surrounding streets, wherever they are, we count them up and we figure out, we need to figure out a plan that can accommodate all those vehicles legally and safely. So that's the challenge that we're faced with as staff. So we will brainstorm, we'll come up with dozens of ideas, sometimes different concepts, and we will share those concepts with the schools. And this example here that's on the screen was option number 2 out of, I believe, five different options that we had created for Sundance. And this was the one that the principal had chosen to accept, and she had coordinated with some of her staff as well. And so we moved forward with this one. It involved relocations of 2 of their crosswalks, creation of new legal parking space that was formerly not legal because it was a bike lane, so now we were able to make legal parking as an option for parents. And we diffused the pickup area by creating 2 pickup zones, one off Choya for the K through 2 students, and a pickup area for the grades 3 through 8 students. That, as you can kind of see, that line of green cars on 71st Avenue, that goes off the screen for a while because we had hundreds and hundreds of feet of queuing space, legal queuing space that didn't create a safety concern, to diffuse some of the concentration of traffic activities at 71st Avenue in Choya. Another example is when we work with a new school. Anytime a new school comes in, part of the requirement is, of course, a traffic study. And when they do a traffic study, in my opinion, the most important part of the traffic study is to look at the circulation plan. We have a projection of how many parent vehicles to expect at any school based on the student population. And unfortunately, this is something that's not as well established as the ITE trip generation that we sometimes refer to. You look up a land use code, there are 3 thick books that tell you exactly how many vehicles to expect. We don't have the same benefit for schools, unfortunately. So what we have here at Peoria is actually the aggregate collection of 20 years of data collection at both the city of Phoenix and Peoria. Most of that collected by myself over the years. And we have cross-referenced this with other resources out there, particularly North Carolina has a school traffic calculator that oddly enough aligns very closely with our requirements. So I think it's very fascinating. I'm probably the only person who does, because North Carolina is very different than Peoria in that it's much more rural and their schools tend to be more remote. But this example is the Academy of Math and Science. And to give a very brief overview of some of the requirements we had placed for the Academy of Math and Science, I'll break it down into off-site and on-site elements. So one of the most visual is that we required a new traffic signal at 77th Avenue in Peoria. That we know from the traffic study that would be a very beneficial element to mitigate some of the traffic concerns from the school. We also required additional off-street parking just in case all our calculations for queues, it still wasn't enough. We love to have contingency space, especially for high traffic events. The first day of school, we can never have enough queuing for the first day of school, but the more contingency space we have, the better, and that's what we plan for at this location. We also provided a very long right turn lane on Peoria. Once again, if it spills beyond campus, we have additional queuing. We granted access to a bus stop where there were minimized crossings of students conflicting with driving parents. And finally, we required a crosswalk to the Walmart property, just in case some parents chose to park in the Walmart lot and walk over to the school, which some do choose to do. On-site, here's a little bit of a zoom in of the campus. We do have a development agreement with the school. It was the first example in Peoria where we had a number of requirements, and one of them was that they followed the circulation plan we developed. Very important. We spend a lot of time with the development, with the circulation plan, but if day one, the principal of the school doesn't use it, that effort doesn't do us any good. So that was an essential element of the development agreement. But in this particular example, we had two separate loading areas. One was along the south end of the campus, along that green open space, and one was along the east side of the building where you see a couple of lanes painted. What's unique to this location is the sheer number of queuing lanes. There's a total of 10 queuing lanes. And it may seem excessive, but we know from many, many other cases that it's not an unreasonable amount based on what the schools actually generate based on a school of that size. And the thing I can tell you is this was the first school in my 20-year career in traffic engineering where the traffic backups onto the adjacent street were gone by day 2. I can tell you I've spent many, many hours at school campuses on campus working with schools to revise their pickup plans. I have never set foot on this campus during an arrival or dismissal, so I don't know about the intricacies of their pickup plan. If they're using our plan precisely, I don't have to know. That, to me, is the greatest success we've seen so far. And this is really the culmination of 20 years of work, compromising, working with schools to finally get a site that does not have that detrimental impact on surrounding traffic. So this is a huge success to me, and I think it's from what I've heard, it's actually become a model for the Academy of Math and Science campuses. If they have a new one, I heard had opened in Avondale. I've not seen it for myself, but I'm gonna have to go check it out to see if that is the case. And that makes me very proud. And this is just a couple of quick screenshots from the campus from our CCTV at 79th Avenue in Peoria. This shows the queue, a double queue of vehicles lining up at the Academy of Math and Science for their pickup in the afternoon. And this is kind of a panned view, so you can see the cars queued up. You don't see any backup onto Peoria. And this is just a few minutes later, sometime later, as the different areas started loading up again. I don't know the intricacies of when they queue up which areas, but it has never, from what I've heard, we just don't see it backing up onto Peoria Avenue again, which is a great success. Well, with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions you may have and see if anyone else is as fascinated with school traffic as I am.
Thank you, appreciate that. Commissioner Hutchinson.
Thanks, Chair. Brandon, so how many physical cars go through there, like in the morning and the afternoon? Any idea approximately?
I actually don't know. The maximum queue was based on a calculation assuming 25 feet per vehicle. I can tell you it was about a mile of queuing.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of cars.
That's a lot of cars.
Yeah, and that is the accommodation for queuing at one time. That's not necessarily the total number of parents because there are staggered dismissals. So I've never actually performed a count of the total number of vehicles during a typical arrival or dismissal.
And do you have I don't know, any kind of metrics that trigger your involvement with a particular school in their traffic issues in the morning and the afternoon? Any particular number or trigger point or any kind of metric?
Chairman, Commission members, we don't unfortunately have any kind of metric. We do occasionally report how many schools we've worked with in a given year, but it's more of just a total number of schools that had heavier involvement. But there's not necessarily a strong metric for success or failure, just that we had worked with those schools.
Okay, well, thank you.
Any other commissioners? Commissioner Schaefer?
Mr. Fourie, thank you for your presentation. It was great, and that model is pretty impressive. Question for you. We're now 1 to 2 weeks back into school. Is there any schools right now that the city has concern with traffic that you're currently working on?
Chairman Alsop and Commission Member Schaefer, absolutely. I have a waiting list of schools that have contacted me since the beginning of the school year. We try not to do assessments during the first couple weeks of school because we don't get a true assessment of the impact of the school. We want to make sure we wait until parents, students, and staff settle into a routine before we do our assessments. But there are a few schools that are on the waiting list right now for me to work with them.
Thank you. No, absolutely makes sense to wait because you do see it die down. And just a piggyback on that question, there's a school I know of concern when we're looking at development in the North Peoria Regional Medical Center up north off of Lake Pleasant, which is right next to Basis. And there's no queuing lane on Lake Pleasant Parkway. And it becomes a significant risk for the community around. So I don't know if that's on your list as well.
Chairman Alsop and Commission Member Schaefer, I am very familiar with Basis. I'm very familiar with their staff. It's an ongoing challenge anytime you have so many students at a school when backups are onto an arterial street. We're going to continue to work with Basis. Basis does continue to work to implement our recommendations to minimize the occurrence of those backups. We've seen dramatic improvements over the last week or so from those backups. However, it does still occur, but from what we have observed from our CCTV cameras, we've gone to for example, I think the first day of school, we may have had an hour to an hour and a half backup on Lake Pleasant Parkway to where we're seeing maybe 2 minutes at a time where the queue temporarily spills out into the bike lane and then there's a bit of an ebb and flow to it. But it's certainly not perfect. It's a challenging site, but we do continue to work with them.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Grice?
How many staff work with you to accomplish this?
Chairman Alsop and Commission Member Grice and members of the Commission. The non-ITS component of Traffic Engineering Division consists of, excuse me, of 2 individuals. Myself and we now have a newly hired traffic engineer, Austin Kennedy, who works with me. But we do also have the support from our entire division, which consists of our city traffic engineer, Chris Lemke, and 2 other engineers, Jody Breifogel and Steve McKenzie. And we all support each other. In fact, a lot of the coordination with CCTV footage, setting up what we call guard tours, where the cameras will pan across and monitor the schools so we can come back later and watch the footage. We don't have to watch it live a lot of times. That's a huge time saver for us, where we can watch multiple schools in 15 minutes. And we do get a lot of support from our division, even though we are let's call us a very lean group.
It's very impressive, and it's a very needed service that the city is doing. So, I mean, I just must commend you and all of the staff that works with you. I mean, it's just awesome what you guys have done to be able to control that amount of traffic. It's impressive.
Thank you.
Commissioner Waitman?
Thank you, Chair Alsop. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I'm always amazed by your wealth of knowledge and your passion for city and the traffic. I know that we spoke a lot about the backups, but I want to make sure that we are also thinking about the bigger issue here, right? When we're thinking about these backups, I was looking at these pictures you've shown. These cars were very close to each other. So I can only imagine the amount of accidents. And then now I'm thinking about child safety, because we're talking about in school districts, right? If these cars are backed up or people are in a rush, they're trying to get places. And of course, obviously, it shows the success that we have worked with the schools and obviously our our children are being helped crossing, but we also have these drivers that are trying to get places. So my main thing is automatically going to the safety of the students and making sure that also we understand that it's not just we're talking about backups traffic, but we're talking about the safety in general, and we've seen it executed, obviously, correctly, perfectly. I've never seen cars lined up so straight at a schooling district. Usually it looks like a zoo, okay? So my question for you is, you know, this may be a little further in advance. Are we looking into possibly, as we're executing this, getting with school boards, understanding that we're not talking about just enforcing rules as a city because we want, you know, traffic to ease up and it to be safer. We're talking about child safety. We're talking about the children there and all over. If they would implement this process, as we've seen done perfectly, that we can guarantee that traffic is less backed up, children are more safe. So are we thinking about going that big, possibly talking to school boards to implement some type of process? Because, you know, what I'm hearing now, it is a long process if we're manually counting cars, and it's two of you all, right? So I'm hoping that we could take that I think the tallier you talked about in the Carolinas, hope the city possibly can assist in that. But are we thinking about getting some assistance, getting with school boards so we can get a little bit of necessity? Because that's one thing that I didn't hear. I heard about the backup traffic, right?
Yes, Commission Chairman Alsup and Commission Member Waitman, thank you for that question. That's a very thoughtful question. And perhaps I didn't give the safety aspect enough weight because the majority of our time is spent speaking with residents that have concerns about the traffic backup. But we do definitely look at safety as a key component of all our circulation plans. In the example of Sundance, we had relocated a couple of crosswalks because we're trying to minimize any of those interactions with the walking students, with all those driving parents to the greatest degree possible. So that's first and foremost when we're doing any of these circulation plans. But to the point of expanding the program, it really does come down to a case-by-case basis as we are contacted. We're a service in waiting at no charge to the schools, and it's irrespective of private, public, K through 8, K through 12, whatever the grades are, as long as it's a school in the city of Peoria, that's a service that's provided for them at no charge. As far as reaching out, we try to build trust with the school districts and in the case of the charter schools, the administration headmasters at those schools, that they know to come to us, that if they're thinking about implementing changes, that they come to us before they do that. And we do have the advantage that most of our schools fall under one school district, the Peoria Unified School District. And that's where we concentrate a good deal of our effort in building those relationships so they know who they can contact. So we are the first ones on their mind when they're having concerns that if a principal is, you know, especially a new principal, may have a different mindset than the previous principal, they know who to contact. And I think we've had great success in that, but it's something we want to continue to build upon.
Thank you. Thank you for elaborating and giving some insight on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have one question as well. In the case of the academy that you'd shown, which is a great example, what is different about that than, say, you know, Brad and our neighbors' basis is one we drive by every day? Is it just the site, as the academy came later and we had input as they were developing it? What's our enforceability and how do we guide them to create a site plan that allows for proper queuing?
Chairman Alsop, members of the commission, that's an excellent question as well. There's several differences. One major difference is the Academy of Math and Science was the first example where we had required a development agreement for the school to actually have some level of enforcement for them to hold true to some of the agreements that we had set during the review process of the site. That's something that is unique among the schools in Peoria. It was a model we had received from the city, actually from the city of Scottsdale, and we built upon that first step at another school site. It was another school site in Scottsdale. One of the other main difference is the site itself. Peoria Avenue, though busy, is certainly not Lake Pleasant Parkway. There's a huge difference in both speeds and volumes on those streets. So backups onto Peoria were less of a concern. They're still a concern, but it wasn't as much of a concern. But it's also important to note that the surrounding area gave us more options. For example, 79th Avenue itself, north of Peoria, there's additional on-street parking opportunities if the school overflows. That was a great benefit that we really don't have anywhere near the Basis campus. The other concern with the Basis campus was we were able to get the current queuing requirements with their new campus, but their existing campus was when we were still developing those new requirements because it was uncharted territories. Back when the first Basis came in, we would try to get as much queuing as possible, but we didn't have a true measure at that time of the impact of a charter school where 100% of the kids were being driven to school. So it's kind of an evolution. If that site were to come in today, we might be able to do better, but I will tell you it is still a very challenging site due to the limited access that we see today.
So a follow-up question, make sure I'm understanding correctly. When I worked in development, say you wanted to build a Target, I mean, parking was the number 2 thing after getting the right corner. What's the parking commitment, and the building is going to be based off parking. Because you want the building as big as you can, but you can't have 10,000 parking spaces. Do we do that with the schools going forward? Will we say, if you want a 10,000 square foot school or a school of 500 kids, you got to have X amount of space for queuing?
Yeah, Chairman Alsup and members of the commission, that's exactly correct. That's something that's discussed during the traffic study. We have a calculation based on the number of students and based on the school type. It's a very simple calculation per child that says how many feet of on-site queuing we require for the school. And then in addition to meeting or doing our best to meet that minimum required queuing, we also look for opportunities if the queue does exceed that distance, where does it spill out onto the street? So we try to work contingency design into every site plan that we see. So if it does exceed that threshold, what happens to the line at that point? So we try to have some buffer even beyond our calculations for queuing.
Great, appreciate the explanation. Thank you. Commissioners, any other questions or comments? All right, we'll proceed on to item 4R, Design Review Manual Study Session. Staff, please present your report.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, Lori Deaver. I am back before you on a slightly different topic, if you will, but one that is most important to the Planning Department as well as to the city in general. So this evening, in terms of an agenda, it is first and foremost going to do a little education for our folks at home that may not be familiar with some of the development process and some of the tools that we use. But secondly, it's a preview, a coming of attractions that you and I will be spending some quality time for the rest of the year talking about design review standards. Now, Planning and Zoning Commission does impact some of that decision by when we bring cases before you through the general plan and zoning request. So we'll talk a little bit in terms of where this particular commission fits in and where other boards and commissions fit in as well. So let's get started with talking about the development process. In terms of tools, I've spent many a wonderful night in front talking about the general plan, but for those that may be online and watching at home, just to recap, it is a visionary document. It's a foundation. It has our vision, our goals and objectives of what we want to be when we grow up in 20 years and beyond. And it guides the land use decision, and that's an important distinction that I'll touch on briefly in some of the couple of slides from now. The second is the Peoria zoning ordinance, and that gets into the regulatory document. So as you may be in a general plan talking about crayons, now in a zoning ordinance, you're getting into the colored pencils and you're starting to sketch it in a little bit more. You start talking height, setbacks, and so forth. Now you're going to make it pretty when you get into the design review manual aspect. So we're talking about the aesthetics, the fit, the form, and the function That in particular impacts how how a person perceives space and what they view as good development and what they, So that design review manual does have a nexus coming all the way from the general plan. So I did want to dust off an oldie but a goodie in terms of an image that we've seen a couple of times in front. So from all things come the general plan. So when we talk about the zoning ordinance and the design review manual, first we start with the vision, the general plan. You can see the chapters that we had within it to talk about smart growth, healthy neighborhoods, et cetera. Those key policies within there do get reflected and implemented through our master plans documents, through our implementation tools. So you'll see the zoning ordinance and the design review manual attached to smart growth, if you will. So they are the implementation mechanisms of the general plan. Looking at it at a slightly different version, I'm going to walk you through. It's a little bit hard to see. Eventually, we will have this graphic on the city's website at some point to help kind of use as an illustration. But starting from the left, you have the entitlement side, the general plan. And as you can, if you remember, the general plan land use colors are not tied to one parcel. They're big blobs, and they can go in certain areas. A couple of myths and limitations. We use a concept approach when we talk general plan. We talk land use categories that provide a range of uses. Some people think that we set specific businesses or specific business types within the general plan, and that's not an accurate statement. What is accurate is we start defining and sketching out what possibly can go within that area. The next step in orange is zoning, and that's where we start really defining what it means. Lot sizes, if it's residential, the types of uses, if it's non-residential, the building height, setbacks. This gets into the look and feel when somebody provides us the comment, well, we think the buildings are too close. That is a function of the zoning ordinance. That's not a function of the design review manual. So that is a key distinction that we try to emphasize to people. When some folks come before you at a particular commission meeting, they may say, I don't want grocery X, Y, and Z. I would rather have A, B, C instead. The zoning ordinance does not allow you to do that. We simply say, you're residential, you can be this particular type of house, or if you're commercial, you can be these type of businesses if you fit within this category. Here's your height, here's your setbacks. We start defining the box of development. So moving forward, we start talking out of the public realm. In the entitlement section, we start getting into conceptual planning. What does that mean? The developer moves into an administrative process. This is where staff gets in kind of the nuts and the bolts, how to make it technically work. So the three things that you see in green is a preliminary plat. When we're talking residential, that's where the homes lay out, where the cul-de-sacs are, where the entry features are, what the landscaping is going to look like, what the entry monumentation is going to look like, starts to set the character of what the community is going to be. From a residential design review standpoint, we get into the house types, the colors, the articulation of how far they are up against the street, how far they start moving back, and what the look and the feel is. From a commercial and a employment consideration, we talk about the building placement, probably we get into public gathering areas, we get into elevations, how big the parking areas are going to be, things of that nature. That's where the design review manual is the focus of everything in that green area. Once they pass green for go, they're about ready to go into construction documents, and at some point soon in the future, you're going to see vertical construction after that. So it's an important reminder that while commission, you don't necessarily see it within the design review manual state. What you do is influence what the type of developments that we will see in the future through the entitlement process. And that's why, as we move forward with this update, we're going to be spending some quality time with one another. So I wish I could say planners rule the world and we have the greatest influence of design, but we don't. That's what my other cohorts tell me here. In addition to what the planning, what the zoning code says and what the design review manual says, we also have to consider engineering and public works standards. How does the site grade, drainage, retention? People don't like ponding water on their site. It causes mosquitoes. So we like the water to eventually go away. If we have transit connections to be made, ADA access points, people like to have their trash picked up, things of that nature. So there are certain standards that we have to follow. In addition, our fire department reviews from their standpoint as well. We have site and building access where the fire hydrants are, because if an emergency occurs, we want to make sure that, the response can be made. So we ask our applicants, our architects, our consultants, yes, you have a vision, but you need to comply with all these codes and regulations. You have to balance that with market realities, adopted codes, and at the end of the day, we're looking for quality design. So let's talk about the update, but first and foremost, what I do want to do is mention that the city of Peoria has received numerous accolades in terms of who we are and what we are as a city, and we've been ranked #1 different times for various things. So we're obviously doing something right. However, while you're leading, if you're not innovating, you're soon going to follow, and that's what we're going to do. Is part of the mission of the general plan is to look forward and continue to evolve. Just because we're good today, we want to make sure we're the best in the future. So we are doing an update. This is a planning department leading this effort. We're not doing it alone. As I mentioned, there's a number of disciplines that do touch this on a regular basis just from an internal standpoint from the city. So we are asking for technical expertise from multiple departments and divisions. But before I kind of get into some of all of that, I do want to give you a little bit of context and background, and I am going to lean to one of my seniors here who's spent more time a little bit on there. So if you would, Mr. Hawkes, would you walk us through the original design review manual a while ago?
I sure are. Good evening, Commission. Yes, because I worked with the original design review manual here. As Lori mentioned, I think there's a recognition that we've got some very good policies within our design review manual, but there's also recognition that, development's changing, right? We've seen a change in the retail landscape. We see preferences change on the types of developments people want to frequent. And so it's important for us to continually be relevant and update the policies to respond to, new preferences and new types of development that's coming in. Our first design review manual was back in 1997, and at that time, we were a young, growing city, and we had a manual that was overly objective, meaning that we actually scored different types of development. You'd have to have a passing score in a certain area and overall get a passing score for the development. It was kind of an innovative way to look at things, but I think what we discovered back then is you could pass in several categories and overall get a passing score, but it didn't always come out to be a great design. So I think what we learned is, you really can't quantify good design. It's a mix of having some requirements in place, but also room for flexibility, have some qualitative design considerations. So we knew back then that the overly objective process wasn't going to work. So we developed our 2.0, Design Review 2.0 in 2008, and that's the current version that we have, and that was a mix of requirements and considerations, and we tried to infuse a lot of pictures to identify attributes that we're trying to accomplish through the development type. So now, as we going into this update, we're emphasizing key areas within the Design Review Manual. Certainly, the placemaking has been a big topic of discussion, sense of arrival, and I think Lori will get into some of these areas, but we're trying to really, while we're focused on the overall update, we are focusing on some areas of emphasis as well as we move forward. So this will be Design Review 3.0 as we talk about it.
Indeed it shall be. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, we are going to be spending some quality time over the next couple of months, and I'll show you the milestones and the schedule here coming up. However, as I alluded to in the previous part of the presentation, the commission does not oversee design review once it gets past entitlement stage. We actually have a design review board. They do review and recommend any changes to the design standards to City Council. So ultimately, it will be their call moving forward what the recommendations would be. If for some reason there is a challenge to a staff decision as we're moving forward with a case, it is ultimately the design review board's purview to then see if staff made an error, make a recommendation or a change, and they are the authoritative body making that decision. So while they do play an important part, we do want to recognize that there's additional stakeholders that need to be recognized and included in the process. So we are actually talking to a number of boards and commissions. We are including our design and technical professionals both in-house and those who are on the private sector side. We are also reaching out to the industry organizations and representatives at key points in order to allow them to have, number one, find out about the update, number two, provide input in that regard. In terms of what we're trying to do as objectives, first and foremost, everything goes back to the general plan. So yes, we are supporting the policies of the general plan. Second is to clarify the expectations and set the objectives regarding what we mean for quality development in Peoria. We're going to build upon those land uses and development standards in the zoning ordinance, and that's something that the commission touches on a regular basis. But in doing so and making those updates to the design review manual, our focus is going to be on the architectural fit and form of the buildings. So one of the key items that we're already making a recommendation to is a name change, because design review manual seems very kind of stilted. What we're actually doing is we're building a community. So we are making the rebranding to community design guidelines. That's where we're at right now. Secondly, what do we mean by design excellence? Well, you know it when you see it, but it's good to have some, basically some common understanding as to what we're looking for. And as Chris and I have both kind of talked about, that strengthening of a sense of place and community identity is going to be interwoven throughout and take a more prominent role in how we approach design. But part of what is also within the general plan is we want to provide allowances for innovation and use of sustainable materials where it makes sense. So that is going to be incorporated within the update. It is a relatively aggressive, condensed schedule. This is an important task ahead of us. We do have a number of touch points with the other boards and commissions for sure. So I will be spending many meetings with folks coming up. But what does this mean for the commission? As you can see on the screen, we're going to break down into a number of topics and chapters throughout. So pretty much every month I will be back in front of you talking about various sections within the update itself. We also are going to touch base with City Council during the September 28th study session. Mr. Hawkes is going to do the presentation and talk about some policy considerations and have them weigh in on a couple of items. We do have a couple of open houses identified. When we get those exact dates, time, and schedule, what we intend to do is go out to those stakeholders and formally invite them to the table for the conversation. Ultimately, we hope to do a formal presentation and recommendation to the Design Review Board in January with formal consideration by Council February of next year. So let's get into chapters and topics. And I think, again, this is just a preview of coming attractions, so I'm going to go pretty quickly in these next couple of slides. But first, as I talked about, we're establishing the definition for design excellence. What does that mean? And it's going to form the basis. It's going to talk about philosophies and values that we hold dear for Peoria and how that translates into design standards that are provided within the document. Currently, we have multifamily and single family separated out within the document. We are lumping them together into a residential category, chapter, if you will. I'm just going to briefly touch on a few things. But again, it's the neighborhood character It's the context in which that project is and what's surrounding it. It's the entry. When we're talking single family, the garage placement or the dominance of those garages on the street, landscaping and shade play a very key component in terms of how the look and the feel is of that community, the quality and durability of the colors and materials selected, what it looks like, how it feels, and if once you're a resident, how do you get in and out and connectivity, walkability within the area. A similar approach from commercial in the mixed use. In this particular one, it's slightly different where the project entries and sense of arrival become more prevalent in the conversation because you want to know when you're driving to a location that you have arrived at the project. What are the public gathering spaces that you have to hang out? We don't want you to just go to one place, get in your car and go to another place. We want you to have an experience at that location. So we're looking at those things. Again, architectural style and character, the parking lots. We love the sea of parking when it comes Christmas time, but we don't love the sea of parking during a regular basis. So how do we minimize those particular aspects of it? From a business, commerce, and employment setting, we do have to look at things differently because of some of the operational considerations of those type of businesses. You've got big trucks, typically. You've got heavy equipment moving back and forth. Maneuverability, access, security are a little bit of a different conversation. So from an architectural standpoint, anything that you see in the public realm becomes more important to execute correctly, and recognizing that when it's in back of house operations, when to get into the discussion, when to stay out of the discussion. That's part of what we do within the design review manual. One of the last chapters that we're looking at is the Old Town core area. We actually have standards for Old Town in a supplemental section. This is becoming more of a prominent area. It's one of the key focuses within the general plan. So we're taking it out of a supplemental section and we're giving it its own chapter. We're talking with the Historic Preservation Commission in terms of what that core area really feels, how it acts. So they're weighing in that aspect as well. But it has a different character, a different feeling of what we're trying to do within the Old Town core area compared to some of the other areas elsewhere, P83 area, Four Corners, things of that nature. So it's going to have more of a focus on walkability, short blocks. Think of right outside here when you're going on Washington, 83rd Avenue, what does that look and feel like? So looking ahead, I hope to have your attention because I'm sending out homework in the next packet and future packets as well. We are looking forward to our next meeting. It's going to be September 16th. We're going to cover design excellence, and we're going to start getting into the residential discussion more in depth, and that's where we're going to ask Commission some key questions. So we're hoping that you put on your thinking hats, both as residents and as Commission members, and those who are industry representatives, your perspectives in what those design standards mean. So some of you might be multitasking that night. And then followed in October 21st, we're continuing the discussion and we're also getting into Old Town as well. So that concludes my preview of things to come. I would answer any questions if Commission has that.
Thank you. Do you have any questions or comments from commissioners? I do have one. And maybe this is something we'll discuss later in detail, I suspect. And I think Chris's explanation of the timing of the design review manual gives me some perspective. One thing I've noticed when I'm driving through at Four Corners, at Happy Valley and Lake Pleasant Parkway, and this is a pet peeve of mine, all the buildings, the backs face the street. So all I'm looking at is their service doors or their trash cans. And then in comparison, 83rd and Happy Valley, those two commercial buildings, while they're slightly different uses, it has a completely different feel to it. And, and I think Four Corners is good, but I as I drive by what I see as the commercial buildings on 83rd, I think, wow, that is so much better. And you're talking about place and the way we experience it, and all those things drove me crazy when I was in planning school. And now as I get older, I appreciate them more. So I would be really interested to see, and maybe, I know that Four Corners was under the old design review manual, and, those are always getting upgraded, and 83rd is newer, but, what was done in 83rd, I was really happy to see that, and happy to see that, that was right down the street from my house. So those are certainly things that I'll be looking forward to.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, Chairman Alsop, great observation, great question. Certainly, there's always an attempt to try to not only break up large parking fields, but perhaps hide them behind buildings. And sometimes the execution doesn't happen properly. The good example is probably 83rd and Thunderbird, where you have the building push up to the street. There isn't a lot of good design, but you're looking at the back of the building. So it's an important consideration in how that execution occurs. Are we properly interfacing with the right, public space amenities along the street frontage? How are we disguising or interrupting, service aisles and drive-throughs and things like that? So that's always a point of contention, always a point of discussion. I agree, 83rd and Happy Valley, we've been very pleased with the way that corner has turned out. Other corners, if we were to look at the Four Corners again, perhaps we would have approached it a little differently though. But the general idea was to try to have parking behind buildings, so.
Sure, yep. And the parking lot is filling up, which I appreciate, because I hate empty parking lots. So my wife was complaining, we went to Haymaker and the parking lot was full, and I said I was so happy to see a full parking lot, because empty parking lots drive me crazy. Any other comments? We'll proceed to item 5R, Water Resources Update.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, while we switch out, I'll just provide some opening remarks. We're definitely pleased to have Kate Powers, he's our Water Services Director, and also Brett Fleck, he's our Water Resource Manager. So this department, they're responsible for managing and operating the city's water supply and all the related infrastructure. So as we have discussions with the Commission on Growth and Development, most assuredly, it's very important that we have an understanding of the city's available water resources, supplies, and how that management coincides with development. The city operates within the council-adopted principles of sound water management. This is the guiding document of how we manage the city's water supplies. And this has served us well over the years. We've had a very diverse water portfolio, as you'll hear tonight. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss the water portfolio, how we plan for future growth, and then a segment of the discussion tonight is you may have heard about the Tier 1 water shortage. So we're going to talk about what is that, what does that mean, how does it impact Arizona and Peoria's water supply. So with that, I'm going to first kick it over to Kate Powers, our Water Services Director.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, thank you for having us here this evening. It's just an absolute pleasure to be able to come here and talk to you guys about Water Services Department. I've been with the city for about 3 years, so I know we haven't been here in that amount of time. We should perhaps come more often and let you guys know what we're up to. The Water Services Department is made up of about 6 primary groups. We have our plant operations group that runs the water and wastewater treatment plants. We have a field operations group that works in distribution, production of water and wells and taking care of tanks and things like that. We also have a group that does wastewater collections, a planning and engineering group, administrative group, and then the sustainability efforts of the city are housed, the coordination aspect of it is housed within Water Services as well. And if you look at the combined efforts of everybody in that group, the most important and most basic thing that we do year in, year out is deliver between 10 and 12 billion gallons of water to citizens of our community. On top of that, we treat about 4 billion gallons of wastewater every year. That is something we take a lot of pride in being able to do in a reliable, cost-efficient manner that maintains and protects public health over time. We spend a lot of time thinking about public health and providing good, clean drinking water and treating wastewater to a high standard. And it may sound simplistic, but if you're going to deliver that much water, it's also very, very important that you actually have access to enough water to be able to deliver that. And I think what's happened on the Colorado River lately, it's been covered pretty well in a lot of news articles, and certainly a lot of things online, and a lot of pontificating about the impacts of that going forward. It calls into question, how is Peoria doing? How are our water resources doing? And it's a very logical question, and for people to want to know what is happening in that world and what we've done to prepare. It certainly affects a lot of what we do in a community. And so our point of emphasis tonight in this presentation is really going to be around water resources and not necessarily the operational aspects of the department. It's near and dear to my heart, I could go on for hours about just the operations piece, but lucky you, will spare you. We also want to tie in some of the things that are associated with water resources, such as land planning and population growth, and looking forward into how the community is going to build out and how water interacts with all of that. We're putting a lot more time as we move forward into those kinds of topics. And I'm lucky to have here with me Mr. Brett Fleck. Brett Fleck is a water resources manager for the city of Peoria. He is no doubt the city's subject matter expert when it comes to water resources. And so I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to give us what I'm no doubt you'll find to be a pretty transparent and honest review of our water resources and what we look like going into the future.
Thanks, boss. Hi, my name's Brett Fleck. As Cape said, I'm the Water Resources Manager for the City of Peoria. I've been here for just under 2 years now, and previous to that, I spent a number of years working in water policy for Central Arizona. My 2 goals tonight, I actually started with 1 goal, and that was just to talk about water resources, but my second goal is to come across as excited about my job as Brandon is about traffic. So that's now my second goal, I hope. So we'll see how we do there. This is my first time doing this for you all, so I'm glad I didn't screw up my first slide transition. The agenda for tonight is exactly as laid out in your agenda, is that we're going to talk about the water services in general, just to sort of give you a scale of the size of the operation. We're going to talk about Peoria's water portfolio and then how we're currently using it. We're going to talk about Colorado River conditions, as these guys just mentioned, what we have done and what we are continuing to do to prepare for worsening conditions, potentially worsening conditions. And then lastly, really where it comes in with this commission is water resources and growth. As we grow as a city, how do we grow and how do the water resources play into that growth? So first of all, I just wanted to really make your eyes fall asleep with a slide with a giant table on it by giving you an idea of how many folks we're talking about, how many customers, how much water we have, how much it costs, all those sorts of things. So as Cape said, I think it's really impressive that Water Services delivered almost 12 billion gallons of water and treated over 4 billion gallons of water with 98 staff in 2020. I think that's a pretty impressive thing. We have over 60,000 customer accounts, and that represents roughly 170,000 citizens within the city of Peoria. We have 3 treatment plants from a treating water side to 3 wastewater treatment plants. Those operate across 7 pressure zones, and then 3 wastewater basins, and I really wanted to say the word sewer shed because I wasn't aware that was a real word, but it is. Just like a watershed collects water, a sewer shed collects sewer water. So there's something to add to your dictionary. The map on the right is really detailed, and that's actually the official map that we send to the Department of Water Resources every year with an update. And what that shows you are where our water mains are. And you can see pretty clearly from this map that we're about half built out, roughly. The northern half of the city, we got a lot of folks to add, a lot of businesses to add, and a lot of pipes to lay. So keep that in mind as we discuss our water portfolio. So Peoria's water portfolio is made up of 4 sources, and that's really, as Chris mentioned earlier, that really underlies our reliability when it comes to things like drought and shortage. So there's the Central Arizona project, obviously that comes from the Colorado River. There's reclaimed water, which is essentially really highly treated wastewater. There's the Salt River project, which is in the southern area of our city that comes from the mountains to the east. And then of course there's groundwater, and you might see the word sustainable and go, wait a minute, I've always heard that using groundwater is not sustainable. Well, actually the state has determined that, and it makes sense, is that when we use water on our landscape, some of that actually makes its way back into the ground. It's called incidental recharge. It's incidental to us using water. And the state has determined that about 4% of overall water use is considered incidental recharge. And so as long as we use less than 4% of our overall delivery, we're in a sustainable fashion, and we've been doing that. So there is a sustainable amount of groundwater that I want you to keep in mind. The two other bullets that I really want to highlight are that reclaimed water is our most drought-resilient supply. I mean, as people use water, you get reclaimed water. And the other thing that people find interesting is that we're actually using over 95% of it beneficially. It is being highly treated and either used in landscaping areas, or as we recharge most of it for later recovery during times of shortage. So we're beneficially using nearly all of our reclaimed water. And the last thing that I wanted to point out is about SRP water. SRP water is also a very highly reliable supply, but it can only be used, quote unquote, on project, and that's the area, the Salt River Project area. And so the kind of the map in your head that's south of the Arizona Canal and Skunk Creek and east of New River, if you can kind of imagine where that is. I'll have a map later. So that's our portfolio. How are we using it? So this is a makeup of how we used water, how we served water in 2020. You can see there's a pretty good balance between SRP water, CAP water, and well pumping. And one thing I wanted to point out here, just to also, again, something to keep in the back of your mind, there's a really big difference in my world between paper water and wet water, the water that comes out of your tap. In the previous slide, I'm actually just going to jump back to that. This pie chart represents where the water came from, where it originated from. So CAP water comes from the Colorado River, reclaimed water comes from wastewater treatment plants, et cetera. In this slide, you see well pumping makes up 37% of our supply. So when you turn on your tap, on average, 37% of that came from the ground. But from a paper perspective, almost 20% of that originated at the Colorado River. What we did is we brought it in, we recharged it into the ground, and we extracted it with wells later. That's how that works, recharge and recovery. So it's important to remember always that distinction to ask, are we talking about wet water or are we talking about paper water? And that's, in my world, it's very easy to get lost in that distinction. Right now, from this graphic, you can see we're using about 36,600 acre feet, or just under 12 billion gallons. You don't have to remember those numbers. The only thing you need to remember is that that's about half of our water supply that we're using right now. So that's just kind of a thing to remember. So now that you guys have a little bit of an understanding, or just, I guess, a refresher on where our water supplies are from, we should really focus on the one that's in the news literally every day, and that's the Colorado River. So this past Monday, the first ever Tier 1 Colorado River shortage was declared, to no one's surprise. We've been looking at this for 10 years, maybe longer, and been actually planning for this date for about the last year and a half. So it's no surprise to anybody. The thing that, in my world, that we look forward at, and kind of I want to pull the curtain back for you guys a little bit, is that looking further out, what does it look like? And this graphic to the right is straight off the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation's website, and it shows their computer modeling for the next 5 years of how Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam will look. And you can see that it starts in the year 2000 when Lake Mead was almost completely full, and it drops and drops and drops. So you have a huge runoff in 2010 in the spring from the Rocky Mountains, goes up, comes back down, and we've really been treading water since 2014. And unfortunately, due to the last this last year of a really dry winter and really poor runoff, the lake is starting to head south again. And so the Bureau of Reclamation looks forward on that and says, well, if we look at all the history that they have, if it really snows a lot and if it really doesn't snow a lot, what will happen to the lake? And that's sort of that shaded area that you see. The thing that we do, and the thing that I do in my job, is say, well, how do we plan for both of those scenarios? If it's really wet, what do we do? And if it's really dry, what do we do? And right now, we're looking at scenarios following kind of the lower part of that yellow line that would result in some additional cuts potentially beyond what's been agreed to by the Colorado River Basin states. And those are the scenarios that we'll talk about more as we go, as we develop. So the big unknown in this whole thing when I talk about additional cuts is that you can see that those lines curve down. I'm sorry, I'm digging into a little bit too much detail here, but you can see those lines are bending, are on their way down. And I'm sure you guys have heard of the drought contingency plan was in the news. The governor signed it a couple of years ago, and it said, you know, as the lake falls, Arizona will take greater and greater cuts to help stabilize those lake levels. And what this graph shows is those cuts might not be enough. You can see that even with those cuts modeled in here, the lake continues to fall. And so the big unknown for us right now is how much and if any additional cuts will be required to stabilize those lake levels. That's what we plan for. That's what my job is essentially all about. But after I've kind of dug into that, I want to metaphorically put a bottom line on the slide and say the bottom line here, though, is that shortage on the Colorado River doesn't mean shortage at your tap. When you read those news headlines and it says there's a shortage, that's a very poor use of the term. It means there's a reduction in our supply. It doesn't mean that there's a reduction in what comes out of your tap. So I would just want to make that really, really clear. And why that's the case, I'll explain here in the next few slides. So first of all, a Tier 1 cut in Colorado River supplies, or a reduction in Colorado River supplies, is applied by a priority system. And you can see that priority graph on the left. And you can see that the main folks that really receive those reductions are agricultural users in central Arizona, and you might have seen that in some newspaper articles. Peoria's supplies are sort of that base priority level. It's hard if you think higher or lower priority. Technically, they're a lower priority number, but they're of higher priority value. So maybe I shouldn't even have said that. It's very confusing. The point here is, if you look at the table on the right, this is how we do our planning. You look at the Colorado River shortage tier in 2022. That was just declared on Monday. We're going to be in a Tier 1 shortage. And that's when Lake Mead water levels fall between 1,075 feet above sea level or 1,051. So when it's in that range, you're in a Tier 1 shortage. If you then take those numbers and walk them through the priority system, that chart on the left, you can figure out how much of a reduction Peoria would have to take. Well, you can see in that chart at the left, those cuts don't dip down into the dark blue and light blue area. So if you head back over to the table on the right, there's no supply reduction to Peoria. That makes sense. So if you look on the table on the right and you say, what if we go into the next tier of shortage, Tier 2 or Tier 2A or Tier 2B, what will we have? And you can see the reductions. And you say, wow, a Tier 3 results in up to a 20% reduction to the city of Peoria's CAP water supply. What then? We're okay. And we're okay because we're not using all of our CAP supply. Our city is only halfway to build out, which means we're not using half of our supply that we've planned for and purchased over the last number of decades. And so you can see in this chart, it lays out how we've used our CAP water over the last 10 years. And I'll start at the bottom. The bottom, so maybe let's say 37, 38% roughly, we deliver directly to water treatment plants. In this case, most of that is delivered to the Pyramid Peak Water Treatment Plant along the CAP Canal. I think it's technically in Phoenix and managed by Glendale and co-owned by all three of us. That orange area, I think that's orange, is the water that I was talking about earlier. That's the water that we send to a recharge facility. It percolates into the ground, and then we pull it back out with a well. And so if you add those two together, that's Peoria's usage. We're using something like 61% of our CAP supply. The green area is what we percolate into the ground, but don't take back out. We leave it there. We leave it there for a future day when things could potentially be much worse. And the takeaway here is there's a lot of green space in 2020, meaning there's a lot of water that we're storing for the future that if it was cut, it doesn't help our plans, but it also doesn't mean shortage at your tap. That's the idea. So that makes sense. So that dotted line is essentially what we estimate a Tier 3 shortage would do to our portfolio, and you can see it doesn't come near the water that we use. So that's why we're protected. Excuse me. But one thing that we talked about with council back in April looks at our future, and it looks at changes to the Colorado River system and what that means for Peoria's growth plans. Peoria's done a great job in acquiring renewable water supplies to meet build-out demands. In fact, if you look at that chart on the right, it's a rough graphic, but it's actually surprisingly accurate. The water supply at build-out on the right side of that graph is greater than what we anticipate demand being at build-out, and that's fantastic. Peoria's done a great job positioning itself there. However, the latest science suggests that Colorado River cuts, rather than being cyclical, may be more persistent. And that more persistent scenario is represented by that red line. So if you take the supply and then put those cuts in there, the supply dips down, right? So now you can see that demand has the potential to exceed supply at some point in the future. That's sort of the rough explanation of what's going on here. And the idea here is we have time to address that. It's, I would say, at least at very bare minimum a decade out, probably 2 decades out. So we have a good amount of time to address that. But now is the time to begin bending those curves. It's time to think about how we want to grow as a city and make some decisions that impact the design review manual, for example, or cross with that. It's how do we want to grow as a city to ensure that if that red line comes true, we can either bend that dotted line down or acquire more water supply and bend that red line back up. So just to make sure that those don't cross. So while things may seem dire in the newspaper, in my world, they're actually quite hopeful because there are solutions to these issues. So we haven't been sitting on our laurels acquiring water supply over the last couple of decades. We've been doing a lot of other things too to prepare for both short-term and longer-term drought and shortage if they come to pass. So one of the things is storing Central Arizona Project underwater, storing that reclaimed water, underground, excuse me. We've been building reclaimed water transmission mains. You may have heard that the city is actually undertaking a pretty large project to build a reclaimed transmission main from one of our wastewater treatment plants up to Paloma Park so that we can supply our new community park with reclaimed water. In addition to freeing up potable supply, that will help us in a shortage condition. It'll also set the stage someday if we ever need to use reclaimed water as a drinking water supply through direct potable reuse, which you may have heard of before. So it's really it's a short-term and a long-term investment. We've been rehabilitating and drilling new wells to ensure that we have sufficient backup if there are emergency situations. We engage in regional organizations such as the Arizona Municipal Water Users Association that represents nearly 85% of the state's population. We're a member of that. We're siting and expanding underground storage facilities because water doesn't always arrive when you need it to arrive. So sometimes if you have too much, you need to put it in the ground to save it for when you need to pull it out to match demand and supply. We're participating in new water supply discussions to backfill any of those CAP cuts. So in the previous slide, I showed you that dotted red line. Well, we're also participating in projects, discussions, and programs to figure out how to bump that up. And then lastly, that demand curve you saw, that line that arched up, we're working on bending that down with additional water conservation and smart growth practices. So we're really taking an all of the above approach and making sure that we're prepared for that drier future. And then now is where we get to where this commission really crosses with my world. Water resources and growth. So the general plan, as Lori was talking about before, is really the foundation for our water demand projections. You think, well, if the city's half built out, how do we know how much water we need to reach build out? We start with the general plan and we apply water intensity metrics to that. And we say, you know, this many homes per acre generally requires this much water. Very similar to what Brandon was talking about planning for schools and traffic. So we start with the general plan and we build up a water demand projection. Those two pie graphs on the right show you how we used water in 2012, which was the last metrics we have for our current master plan, which we are actually in process of updating right now. And the second pie chart or pie graph on the bottom shows you how we planned to use water in 2065, which was the estimated build-out time of our last master plan. And what's remarkable about these is how similar they are. That large blue section is for residential, both multifamily and single family. And so I think you can take away here is that Peoria is and has plans to be primarily a bedroom community, unless, of course, folks like you decide to recommend changing the general plan, in which we have a different future to plan for. So some of the key takeaways here. Build out water demand roughly equals water supply, as I said earlier, which is fantastic. That is the result of investment and planning for decades on behalf of Peoria councils and commissions like this. It's a great place to be. Colorado River shortage notwithstanding, and that's why I have a job. That's what we're trying to do. And the key here is for you guys is to recognize, and I'm sure you do, and so this is really just a reminder, is that we must all be aware of how changes to general plans and zonings and things like that affect our water resources. If we are a bedroom community in 2012 and somebody decide that we want to have a large semiconductor factory, that changes our water resources situation drastically, and we need to make plans for that. If we decide that instead of having a home every quarter acre, we want, homes stacked vertically, that changes the water demand intensity for that acre. That's a very different outcome. And so decisions like that sort of add up really quickly. And our job is to make sure that we can provide the water and communicate to you the situation that we are with our water to make sure that as we grow, we don't get too far ahead of ourselves. And so, because being cognizant of these trade-offs between growth and water supply is really what it takes to ensure that we have and continue having a sustainable water portfolio. That was a lot, so I'm just going to put this slide up here and pretend that you have no questions.
Thank you, appreciate that, very informative. Commissioners, questions or comments? Commissioner Fighter.
Question for you. Question for you. The most recent rains that we have, is that a measurable impact? Because compared to prior year rain amounts, obviously this has been a heck of a last couple months.
Yeah, that's
Is that like a measurable impact, or is that just a?
So,
Indifferent?
yes and no. That's a great question. Yes and no. On a short-term scale, over the course of the next year or two, absolutely a measurable impact. We were just talking the other day that rain was enough to offset, how many weeks of decline behind Roosevelt Dam of water. So we're in the middle of summer, right? We're using water, the dam levels fall. That rain offset all of that decline. So actually Roosevelt Lake is higher than it was on July 5th due to those rains. So from that perspective, it helps. From a long-term perspective, not really. Not really. I mean, let's just round numbers here. Let's say that those rains provided 100,000 acre feet into Lake Roosevelt. Lake Mead holds 26 million acre feet. So, it's really a drop in the bucket. But great question.
Commissioner Hutchinson.
Thanks, Chair. Great presentation. I learned more in the last half hour about water than I thought I ever knew, so thank you for that. It was really very informative. And it really puts my mind at ease when I know that people like yourselves are overseeing, our supply and knowing that the tap is dependable, at least in our futures.
That's right.
I know there's been a lot of talk about, you mentioned semiconductor plant, being plopped in the middle of Peoria and how that would alter our plans. But I know there are semiconductors in the area, and the allocations to Peoria, I'm sure, and as far as I understand, actually, Peoria is actually integral to some of the water plan for like the semiconductor, the Taiwan plant, and maybe some of the supportive industries. How is that going to impact us? Is that part of our overall scope of the near future, or any reason for concern on our end?
That's a fantastic question, and I think that really all comes down to policy and trade-offs. Like I said in that pie chart, our plans are largely to be a bedroom community, and per acre homes don't use nearly the water that a semiconductor plant or even supporting manufacturing facilities do. And so all I can say from a resource advisor manager position is to say that if Peoria does decide that that's in its best interest, that we just keep the water resources portfolio in mind and take the necessary steps to make sure that we're ready for that.
And if I may, just a follow-up to that, thank you. The reclamation technology is developed. I mean, I've done a lot of construction work in reclamation plants in the 91st Avenue plant. I mean, I've been pretty involved. I always really, I found the whole system of water in Arizona fascinating, throughout my career. But I know that the technology is still advancing, and even within the semiconductor industry, they're even talking 100% sustainability, and can you speak to like some of that, capturing some of that technology and even instituting it into our water plan and even being more, it seems like we save more than we consume, actually, because some of your graphs seem that way, but, obviously that's not the case, but do we get to that day? I mean, where everything we use is...
Yeah, it's so, a lot of answers or discussion topics in there. One, again, my background's in economics, so everything to me is an opportunity cost and a trade-off, so I'll just start there. But yeah, there's some really amazing technology out there for recycling water and reusing water. In the case of semiconductor plants, they need an extremely high quality of water, and so for them, and obviously their profit margins are quite comfortable. So they're able to invest in the latest and greatest technology to support their operations. We have some really impressive wastewater plants. We actually call them water reclamation facilities because that's what they are. They're reclaiming our supply. We have 3 water reclamation facilities that produce the highest rated affluent reclaimed water. There's many names for it, unfortunately. They produce the highest quality of effluent rated in Arizona. It's called A+ effluent. That can be used on field crops. It can be used on golf courses and things like that. And you can recharge it in the ground and pull it out at a later date. Right now, we're not set up just yet to treat that to where you can turn around and put that right into a tap. We're not at that level. That technology exists. It's also very, very costly. And so that may be in Peoria's future if Colorado River cuts, end up on the worst end of this, on the poorer end of the scale. That could be in Peoria's future. I know a number of cities in the valley are seriously considering moving towards that direct potable reuse, which would be a really high quality treatment of effluent, similar, not quite to the extent, but similar to how a semiconductor plant would do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Commissioner Fider?
What level of tier cut do we need to be where amenity water features become at risk? Because right now, tier 1 is just affecting agricultural uses, correct?
Yeah, that's a really great question.
I'm talking like golf courses, amenity lakes, things like that.
Yeah. So the city of Peoria has a drought management plan. They're actually required by law. Ours was last updated pretty recently in 2017. So there's a drought management plan that has 4 stages. And the stages are not neatly aligned with the Colorado River tiers because we have more sources than Colorado River tiers. So that wouldn't make sense necessarily, at least for us, to align those. Some other cities do, and that's how they approach it. We've not decided, at least at this point, to implement the stage 1 of our drought management plan because the stage 1 is defined as when we think it might be necessary to have some cutbacks, when we might not be able to meet our demands. And tier 1, keep those straight, tier 1 Colorado River shortage doesn't create that scenario for Peoria because it doesn't impact our water. A tier 2, maybe, it depends. Stage 1 for us is largely a communications plan to make sure that folks know what's coming. People are maybe taking some steps to try to be a little smarter with their water use, be a little bit tighter. So those are discussions that will have to happen at the city manager and council level. And before any of that would happen, the city would activate its drought demand management team, which is defined in the plan. And that's essentially folks from all over the city that come together and say, what can we do? What can the city do internally to lead the way before we ask something of our citizens? So short answer to your question, not anytime this year. Or probably next.
On your graph that showed the supply being the red line, if the city adds 60,000 new customers double what we have. And let's say, I don't know what the commercial amount would be, like 60 sections or something of commercial, some certain amount. Then we would be at the place where our supply and demand are equal.
Yes.
So do we know what that number is, like exactly, like, can we do 60,000? Can we do 80,000? Should we be looking at commercial at only 10 sections instead of 20 sections?
That is an excellent question. And something that probably could occupy about 10 meetings, really. So this chart is sort of a graphical representation of an actual projection from our current master plan. Our current master plan is dated 2015, and we're in the process of updating it. And so over the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to have a lot better numbers on where we stand today going forward, to really put a fine point on your question. Looking at this graph, like I said, is a surprisingly good representation for how rudimentary it is. That supply line is at about 70,000 acre feet, and that demand line is very close to that. It's actually closer than that graph shows. That's based on building out all of the master plan communities that we have, filling those commercial areas and things like that. But when you dig into the details like you're getting at, some of the assumptions we need to be very careful with. So for example, those plans assume that we have rather low intensity commercial and industrial use, office towers, hospitals, things like that. If Peoria decides that it's in its best interest to bring in a relatively high water using business, that shifts that dotted line up. And we have some other decisions to make. We either need to figure out how to use less water elsewhere, or we need to figure out how we're going to acquire more to ensure that the supply line is always above the demand line. So it really comes down to the assumptions that are built into these general plans and our water master plans, and making sure that when we make these decisions about what businesses we bring in, what zoning we change, we make sure that we always ask the question, how does this impact the water situation at build out on the right side of that graph? So that's a great question.
I grew up in Vegas, and Vegas has much more strict water laws than we have here. I believe residents in Vegas have the lowest water use per capita than anywhere else in North America. Coincidentally, my brother was a water attorney in Vegas, so I was texting him this morning on this very subject. When do we start considering adopting similar regulations on residential water use here?
So that's a great comment and question. 2 points to that. The first one would be to say that the reason we haven't gone to that level is because we have some different fundamentals than Las Vegas. One fundamental is that we have, at least in the city of Peoria, 4 sources of water. They have 2, groundwater and Lake Mead. So that's one, is a little less diversity. And then the second reason that Peoria, for example, would be different than Las Vegas is that Las Vegas is very near, if not almost completely, built into their water allocation. We are not. And so Las Vegas, like a lot of large cities that are nearly built out with finite water resources, faces a situation where if they have a water cutback, they need to be sure they're squeezing every value, or whatever you want to call it, out of every drop. So from that aspect, that's kind of the reason why we haven't done that level of restriction to this point. On when that might happen, I'm an advocate for water efficiency all day long. I'd love to see more efficiency, but I'm not in the driver's seat. So I would say we'll see those things when the voters demand those things.
Agreed. I mean, my kids are always complaining because I make them turn off the faucet when they're brushing their teeth, because
So
I
does
grew
my
up
wife.
in super arid desert. And that was just the mentality you're brainwashed from when you're a little kid in Vegas.
You should
Follow-up
bring
question.
some more.
And my personal opinion is water's just going to get more expensive. And I am a terrible water user in my house. My kids just turn on the hose and they play in the backyard. Until, you want to talk economics, until it gets expensive, people aren't really going to start noticing. For example, I think my water bill is $50. I work for APS. People complain all the time about their electricity bill. All of a sudden, they become more interested in lowering their electricity use when their bill is $400. Do we see any need to? I wouldn't propose increasing the water rate just to keep people to use less. But for example, you brought up fully reclaimed water. Is the only barricade to that the technology that we haven't purchased? Is there a perception that we haven't breached yet here, generally in the U.S., because other parts of the world fully do it? What's holding us from 100% recycling the water that we use?
A number of things. You hit on a few of them. I mean, I would say from an implementation standpoint, number one is cost. Direct potable reuse would be one of your most costly water supplies. I mean, many orders of magnitude more costly than SRP water, for example. So that would be number one. Number two, like you already mentioned, would be the sort of ick factor, which I can conceptually understand, but someone like me that's around this stuff and these guys, and you see the treatment processes that go into this, I mean, the water that comes out of those DPR plants is significantly cleaner than the water that comes out of your tap, which already exceeds EPA requirements. So for me, I have no problem drinking water like that, but we have some comfort to get people into that level. So I would say those are the two biggest things. And really, when those two things come to a head are when there's a need. So I often invoke Wichita Falls, Texas. Gosh, it was 4 or 5 years ago. Texas was in a horrible drought, and Wichita Falls was literally looking at day zero, as they talked about in Cape Town, where they were going to run out of water. They were very close to it. And they very quickly built and adopted direct potable reuse. And it's been fantastic for them. And so they got over the cost hump and the ick factor real quickly when there was a decision between having water and not having water. So I hope that we don't end up in a situation like that ever. I'd like to think that we'll plan ahead and see a situation like that coming. But I personally, in my realm, absolutely foresee a day where we will be doing that.
And I know desal's not an option for us, but it could be an allocation issue. At what point is desal cheaper than fully reclaimed water?
I gotta say, I couldn't provide you a real great example of that. I wouldn't want to speculate on whether the costs are comparable. I know that both of them are significantly more expensive than our most expensive supply today. If you have any comments on that, Cape, I would welcome it.
No, you're correct, and it's tough as a water resource person to take on DPR, just because when it becomes your base water supply, you're going to end up paying those high costs on out into perpetuity. I think eventually, at least some communities in the valley will need to do that. And when we talk about the ick factor and all that, why don't we do it? It's because we just haven't needed to yet. But someday, some communities will be there. It's, the city of Scottsdale has a demonstration project where they proved the technology, not that it needed to be proved. It's been proved in Texas and California and other parts of the world. But it's definitely a possibility someday. If you look at the supply and demand curves and you realize that you can do DPR and ramp up that supply curve pretty quickly, it becomes a viable option at some point down the road.
Thank you. Commissioner Fider?
I have to admit, I'm completely jealous of your $50 water bill. Do you guys know what the average water bill is in our city? Ballpark?
Ooh, I'm going to defer to Cape on this one.
I'm going to say that I don't want to guess, and I don't know an exact number.
I miss my days in finance.
Yeah.
I miss my days, and I used to do finance and economics, and I would have known that answer to that question like that, but not anymore.
And it depends.
150 for me. Yeah, I am jealous of that too. 3 daughters too. That's 3 daughters.
And you were, Commissioner Alsop, you were talking about earlier, just to kind of play off of that comment or question, is that you were talking about earlier is that when it becomes more expensive and people notice it, and just like with electricity, we're very cognizant of the idea between it being expensive to notice it and being too expensive to have it at all. And, running your air conditioner in the middle of summer, for example, that's not really an option. Having a base level of water to wash your hands and drink in the city of Peoria, that's not an option. And so we're very cognizant, obviously it's not our call, but we're very cognizant of the idea of being able to make the investments we need to have a reliable water supply while also making sure that folks can afford it. And so, you get into the whole rate design and having your, increasing tiers and things like that. And those are policy discussions that are well beyond my pay grade.
Yeah, commission members, hopefully you're all aware that we do have a tiered rate structure in place, so that as you use more, you pay more. And there's the very lowest level of that is more of almost what I'll call a social equity rate, where it's low enough so that anybody, despite economic standing, can afford to have basic supplied water to your house, but certainly not a great big green lawn. And then it tiers up from there. We have internal debates about the height of those tiers and how high they ramp up and what what should be the most cost. Spent a lot of my career in Washington State, which everybody thinks is being very wet, and I can tell you that the tiers up there are far higher and far more extreme than they are down here in Arizona. And so there are cases out there where I think our top tier now is between $4 and $5 per 1,000 gallons, and up there's places where it's 14, 17 bucks per 1,000 gallons. So over time, it's all about needing to adopt those measures and needing to take on more money to pay for things, and we haven't reached that point yet.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Any other comments? Oh, Commissioner Waitman.
I think in closing, you answered my question. My industry is renewable energy and resources. So my question was, for clarification, as you elaborated on some outer cities possibly in the future having to reuse some of our water, or water resources. Do you have any projected date on, projected timeline, years, or how long that would be? Just for myself. I would like to know, because this is the first time that I've been so wonderfully educated on our water, and you did do it with a lot of passion, so I hope you can take that, yeah. But I kind of want to know what we're looking at. That's my industry, and as the city the city is developing, and as we see, the future is going to be renewable, whether it's energy, resources, water. We see these programs, these curriculums being added to different schools. ASU has a whole program now. I'm in hiring, so I've hired a lot of students that are coming into this field. Water is one of these things. We're talking about oil, gas, and all different things. But when we're talking about reusing, that interests me because we are not in a need yet. But if we're looking, and you guys do a lot of market research, what is a projected date? Are we talking a long amount of time? Because I'd like to know.
Yeah, so one, I wanted to put, again, a fine point on the need and reusing is that earlier when I said that we were reusing over 95% of our reclaimed water, that's essentially storing it for later. But when you look at these graphs, for example, like the supply graph, that assumes that we are reusing all of our projected reclaimed water. And so sometimes, and this isn't from your question, but I just wanted to address it, sometimes there's a perception out there that folks in central Arizona just are treating water and it just goes somewhere, we're not reusing it. And actually that couldn't be farther from the truth. Almost every drop of water that comes out of a wastewater treatment plant in Arizona has a home, whether it's for irrigation of a golf course or a park, or whether it's for agricultural crops. In fact, a lot of it goes to cool the Palo Verde nuclear power station, a significant portion of it. And so we're actively reusing the vast majority of our reclaimed water. And so it's not an unutilized supply, but it perhaps may be an underutilized supply, depending on how you look at it. Regarding timeline, the timeline of a direct reuse as opposed to an indirect reuse like we're doing now depends largely on how fast we grow, how fast our water demand grows, if it's more or less than what we think it will be, and what happens along the Colorado River. If the Colorado River goes down and comes, Lake Mead, I should say, behind the Hoover Dam, if that goes down and comes back, that changes the timeline. If that, go back to it because I like the visual, that really engineering graph. if the bottom edge of that yellow area comes true and sticks down there, direct reuse is going to happen a lot sooner than people think. For the city of Peoria, if I was a betting person, I would say you're probably talking no earlier than 15 years. But boy, that would be a pretty poorly educated guess.
Thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but I do appreciate it. And just to clarify, my thing is not water, okay? I'm in energy, but it does interest me as I've learned a lot. So I definitely think that we have it figured out. And now that I got to meet who we have, the best of the best in the city, I think that we have nothing to worry about. And I'm sure all of our residents watching would agree. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are cognizant of the water energy nexus.
All right, thank you, appreciate it. Thank you for answering all the questions.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.
We'll proceed to number 8, agenda, call to the public on non-agenda items. Do we have any? We do not. We'll proceed to reports from staff.
Great, thank you. Fantastic presentations, all around. That was very interesting. I learned a lot too. It was great. Appreciate that. Just a couple things, reports from staff. Our September 2 meeting has been canceled. We'll see you next time for September 16. As Lori mentioned, that's where we'll talk about design review. The other thing, I won't talk much about it because it's not agenda size, but we did get our census figure in, our 2020 census figure in. We registered at about 191,000. So we saw a growth of 37,000 from 2010 number that we had. So in the days ahead, what I'll do is I'll ask Lori to perhaps put a report from staff, and we'll talk about the upcoming redistricting process, because whenever you have a new census number, we're required to adjust our council districts. So we'll talk about the timeline ahead and how that's going to unfold. Okay? And with that, that's all I have tonight.
All right, do any commissioners have anything to report? Commission updates? See no further business. Adjourn the meeting.